So good day, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'll be your host. My name is Gabriel Gums. I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy with Spirion, and with me on today's webinar is Todd Feynman. He is the founder, one of the founders, and the CPO of Spirion. Todd?
Pleasure to meet everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. I hope we have a good session and we get some great questions at the end, making this a little bit more of a dialogue. So, Gabe, do you want to jump through the agenda and then I'll take them through our beginning, or do you want me to just jump right in?
Let me hit the agenda. I just want to do a little bit more housekeeping also. So if there are questions that folks have, feel free to go ahead and pop them into the questions section of your screen there. We may try and get to some of them live depending on how we're doing with the flow and timing. But as Todd mentioned, we'll leave a little time at the end for Q&A. But if those questions are relevant while we're discussing something, certainly like to keep it conversational. So do so. In terms of agenda, so today's webinar is entitled The Impact of Data Discovery and Data Classification. And we're going to start by laying a little bit of the groundwork and talking about exactly what data discovery and classification is, as well as taking a little closer look at the results from a recent Ponemon study by the same name. Yeah, Todd, if you take it from there.
So it's actually quite exciting. This was our 10-year anniversary as a company. We had the first version of the Spirion product with an older name back in 2006, and it did data discovery only. So over the last 10 years, we've really grown the company to be an expert and thought leader in sensitive data management, as well as preventing companies from having sensitive data sprawl that could lead to data breaches and other harmful things, such as hurting the reputation of the company or their employees, or making it difficult to get the job done because sensitive data wasn't in the right place at the right time. So, of course, we're going to speak through what that means and why that's such a challenging thing, but our company is headquartered in Los Angeles, and we have easily over 1,000 active customers. We actually have several thousand customers, including many that come to us to solve a specific solution such as compliance, though most of our customers are looking for an enterprise solution that helps them really gain an understanding of what classified data they have, who has access to it, where it is, and that sort of stuff. We have a number of customers across various different industries. If you can go to the next slide, Gabe, we'll just put a small representation of healthcare, retail, financial services, banking, hospitality, and restaurants. So, you know, the point of this slide is just to let everybody know we cover the gamut. Data is data. Yes, PHI data is very unique to the healthcare industry, and PCI data is unique to the retail industry and other companies that accept credit cards, and PII might be more unique to the public sector or the education sector than someone else. But the point is, all these companies have data, and there's so much data out there. It's grown over the years. People stopped deleting things a long time ago, and now companies are sitting there with mountains and mountains of data, of which there are quite a bit of sensitive pieces that could lead to significant exposure for the company. So this is just to sort of say, you know, while solutions aren't one size fits all, this is the type of thing where most industries are affected by it.
Very true.
So why did, yeah, go ahead, Gabe. You want to jump in there before I move to the next slide?
No, I was just going to transition you, and we're on the next slide.
So why data discovery, and very specifically classification, which is a very hot topic that's come up over the last few years. So it all began with companies trying to understand their data better. We always used to say, know your data. And what that really means is going through the discovery effort of understanding, where is my sensitive data, what is my sensitive data, whether it's social security numbers, credit card numbers, medical records, intellectual property, etc. Who has access to my data, right? In many cases, companies need all of this sensitive information, but who should have access to it? You know, if you go back to when Sony Motion Pictures was broken into by North Korea, as we saw things getting posted to the internet, there were a lot of spreadsheets that had social security numbers, hundreds and hundreds of spreadsheets. So the question becomes, who should have access to this data? If someone breaks into your company and they get access to one employee in the engineering department, do you want them to get access to SSNs or PCI data, or can you limit that? Now, discovery is great, but the problem is it's for a point in time and it doesn't actually protect anything. It gives you knowledge. So the next piece is essentially classification. More bare bones, it's persistently identifying the most important data to you and ensuring that that data has that identification with it as it moves throughout your organization. Classification is a relatively new technology, but not really when you think about what it is, right? It's tagging the metadata of a file. But the beautiful thing about that is as your data is copied or moved or posted to the cloud, that tag is moving with it. So now if you use other security technologies to make you aware of classified information, like perhaps a DLP product on your email gateway, or potentially a cloud provider that allows you to share data with third parties or other employees, you would have that knowledge before you clicked the send button or you posted to the cloud that this was classified as top secret because it contained intellectual property. So persistently identifying the data is very important, and the more you can automate that process with the discovery so that you're not putting the onus on your employees to do all that work, the more productive your employees will be. Setting policies that can be enforced, of course, it's not just about classifying the data for classification's sake. That doesn't help anybody. But if you could take it to the next level and use those DLP tools, use encryption tools, use cloud tools, use whatever it is in your organization that you might have already made security investments in, to enforce policies like top secret data cannot be emailed. However, public data and maybe even proprietary data could. That's going to be a decision that you make, and Gabe's going to walk through how you think about those things on the next slide a little bit. Before we get there, I'll mention the last two steps. It's obviously very important that we talk about building bridges instead of walls, right? Once you have your data classified, you know who should and who shouldn't have access to it, and you've locked it down in an appropriate way. Now the next step is to make sure you're building those right walls. Keeping your data locked in a vacuum doesn't help your company grow. But if you can make that data accessible to the people who need it, whether that's third parties or not, building those bridges to allow people access to the right data but disallow them access to the wrong data, that's extremely important. And again, you can do that through the use of security investments you've already made or other cloud providers, but it underscores the importance of beginning with that right discovery process and that right classification process, because at the end of the day, those tools only see what you've tagged your metadata as. And if you've tagged your metadata as top secret, it doesn't know if it's really top secret. You must rely on how you do your discovery and classification. Otherwise, all those other security investments fall down. And then lastly, the result of this is to build that culture of data awareness so that you don't have to necessarily use those tools as cops and policemen to constantly slap your employees on the wrist. If you can have that culture where employees understand, oh, I'm saving this spreadsheet and I know it contains credit card numbers, this needs to be protected in a different way than just everything else I do on my regular job.
That's excellent. So the order that we presented these is somewhat intentional. We kind of have that culture of data awareness at the bottom here because of how important it is fundamentally also to this overall process. And we understand is that doing so requires educating the data handlers, the data producers, the data stewards, and so forth as to all the many different ways that they are going to interact with data. And we'll see this a little bit in a few slides ahead when we get into some of the trends, but overall, there's still a lot of just misuse of data, and so in order to build that awareness, it really, a lot of that begins with this understanding of your data. So let's move ahead. So I can kind of reiterate a bit of what Todd said, but I wanted to show you what this looks like in the real world when we do things like build out a classification schema, right? So we define data classification broadly as the process of organizing data by relevant categories, if you would. And you do so to allow data to be used more effectively, more efficiently, if you would, and protected more effectively. What's really important, though, is that in the classification process not only makes that data easier to locate and retrieve, but data classification becomes particularly important as part of an overall risk management, compliance, and data security strategy and program. That is the foundation of a successful data security and privacy program, something that we've known for some time and have been working with and reinforcing with those within our ecosystem and those that come to us for help in any number of different avenues. And we'll get into some of that too when we look at the outcomes of this research. So the current slide here is an excerpt of a classification schema that we developed. And when you perform a similar exercise, what you'll want to do is have something that looks like this, that basically outlines all of the different data types in your environment, why they're important to you, based on the sensitivity and the criticality of the data, and apply those labels as Todd mentioned. So for the purpose of this exercise, we've just created 4 labels, right? We've got public, proprietary, non-sensitive, proprietary and sensitive, and restricted. And that schema is going to apply throughout the enterprise, and again, it'll be based on that criticality of the data so that you can then begin to outline the different types of controls that you're going to put in place. And when we talk about controls, we're talking about all 3 aspects of those. So we're definitely talking about people and process controls because they play a significant part of this. But those technological controls to be able to also backstop those first 2, because as we know and we understand, there's so much breakdown in the human element of this that then becomes more critical than other domains of security. And so in practice, once we have those classification schemas built and we've outlined the different controls there are, and Todd went through this in a bit of detail, so then certain types of information may need to be completely restricted, and you'll then have greater controls, both people, process, and technology in place to restrict that movement of data where it need not be, or the access to data who needs to have and both not have it. And once implemented, it should provide an organization this framework that's going to facilitate more adequate data protection measures and promote that employee compliance within security policies. So again, going back to that overall awareness throughout the organization. Anything you want to add there, Todd, before we move on?
No, that's fantastic.
All right. And the question regarding whether or not these slides will be available, yes. I'm sorry if I didn't answer at the top of the call, and we'll get to that at the end. These slides will be made completely available to everyone, and that's actually a good segue into another bit of housekeeping. So the full 28-page report will be published from the Ponemon Institute and made available to everyone as well. And so for those that may not be completely familiar with the Ponemon Institute, they conduct independent research on privacy, data protection, and information security policy. It's the same organization that's behind the yearly cost of a data breach report that is that's put out in conjunction with IBM. And Larry Ponemon, the primary researcher at the institution, so he's been studying security behaviors and outcomes for a number of years, and is certainly considered one of the leaders in this space. So that's largely why we turned to him to ask him to help facilitate a better understanding of how data discovery and classification is impactful with regards to data protection in general. So let's just set up a bit about the study itself. So there were 3 distinct groups of organizations that were looked at with regards to the study. Those fell into 3 categories. They were those that used data discovery and classification for the data protection programs, and that was via Spirion. There were those that use other commercial methods for the data protection programs. If, for example, DLP, in-motion DLP solutions, and there were those that were doing none of those, and they were using manual ad hoc methods for their overall data protection strategy. And so we compared both their behaviors and their outcomes, and we looked at specifically at a number of different things. And those respondents provide us with information regarding their overall security posture, their ability to locate sensitive data, what their current DLP capabilities were, and the overall economic impact of data breaches in their environments if they had one. And one of the things that we'll see, and that we'll talk a little bit more about, is that one of the reasons why classification and discovery become so important, because we've learned over the many years of doing security that there are no silver bullets, as Todd mentioned, and we are likely to encounter incidents, and sometimes those incidents will lead to outright breaches and other greater things. And so how do we not just go about protecting that data up front, but throughout the entire life cycle? And I'll even consider in today's environment, that life cycle to include post-breach activity. So how do we minimize the impact of those things as well moving forward throughout that? So let's talk a little bit about trends. So I wanted to set the stage by still looking at and understanding where data becomes compromised and kind of reset that framework for those that, again, may not be completely familiar. So we still see that hacking and malware contributing to lots of actual data security incidents, data privacy incidents. I don't need to go through case after case. I'm sure if you follow the news to any degree, you see these things on a regular basis. It's gone from monthly, yearly to daily, and some weeks even hourly. And one of the lines here that you'll notice is that misuse is still pretty high on that trending line as well too, as well as others. And so again, as part of that overall protection strategy, these are some of the primary concerns and risks that our data is facing, and understanding the underlying benefits or the ways that we can create a program to help reduce the impact of that is what we wanted to look at. Let's jump right into some of the key findings. So again, we asked explicitly, right? So we were trying to understand how organizations rated their overall data security posture. And what we found was that companies that use data discovery and classification overall did have a strong security posture. Again, something that we knew intuitively, but wanted to confirm, and then started taking a closer look at why and exactly what were the underpinnings of that made that so. And so 84% of those Spirion users believe that their organization's posture is very effective in mitigating or curtailing the leakage of sensitive data information. And that was in stark contrast to that 46% of others who said that such effectiveness actually existed. And somewhat non-surprisingly, those that were still doing manual and ad hoc efforts fell far below that line. And what that really tells us is that even intuitively, organizations understood that their ability to be able to protect their sensitive information, protect their data, is largely hamstrung by how they're assisted in that overall process. Best describe the organization's sensitive data loss prevention capabilities. So again, wanted to understand exactly what everyone had in place. And because this was performed by the Ponemon Institute, we weren't asking these questions directly, and so we needed to be able to establish, or they needed to establish kind of a level playing field for what everyone's capabilities were. And so with regards to the ability to accurately locate sensitive data throughout the enterprise, we see again that those that were using data classification and data discovery and classification as part of the overall Spirion solution, overall were far more capable to perform that activity in some ways than others were. And then subsequently, the really important part to that then was the ability to set automated policies or decision rules to protect that information. So we discussed that a bit earlier when we looked at the classification scheme, and we laid out the different data types within the environment that would require protection, and then we also started to align those with the different protection and security controls that we wanted to put in place to protect that information. And those are not arbitrary decisions. Those are decisions that are made in conjunction with the business, as well as having an understanding of the overall business processes and what types of data need to be available to whom and how that data needs to be accessible. Let's take another quick look at some of the trends, because I think it'll help set the stage for the upcoming slides when we look at the breach outcomes of the organizations that were part of the study. Several years ago, when this particular bit of research was being collated, those bubbles were far smaller, and there were fewer of them updated on a regular basis these days. What we still see is exactly what everyone knows to be true, which is there is not just is there not a silver bullet, it's not likely that that you'd be able to avoid some type of incident in today's landscape, in today's environment. Attackers, both sophisticated and extremely unsophisticated alike, are capable of gaining access to our data in any number of ways. And the same we saw throughout this bit of research as well. And so what we saw was that organizations experiencing one or more data breaches was pretty much the same across the board. There were some that were certainly just unsure, and I think it's safe to put those in the category of if they don't know what they don't know, and that if the likelihood is that high for everyone else that does have that level of visibility, it's likely that those two very well may have experienced some type of incident, if not some outright data breach. And that was true across the board, regardless of the different types of controls that were in place. To some extent, there was a breach throughout all of these different organizations. What we then started noticing, though, were the differences in the overall impact to those organizations. That is, the post-breach economical impact, things that occurred after the fact, and how the ability to understand both what data was part of an incident, but more importantly, prior to that incident, protecting the information that would have been most at risk in order to reduce any potential impact to the organization in the event that sensitive information had been compromised. And so if we kind of just go down the line and we look at some of those different line items, we looked at, in terms of overall remediation cleanup, there's a 50% reduction with those that had data discovery and classification as the underpinning to their data security program. We see similar percentage trend, a bit over 50% with regards to loss of user productivity. Even greater than that, over 2x difference with regards to disruption to normal business operations. Damage to IT assets and infrastructure, there was a little bit of a smaller gap there to be expected when we're talking about actual infrastructure in terms of the actual damage to data getting out itself. So that one was refreshing to understand that the data was certainly pointing in the direction that we understood it to be even before we had those empirical numbers in hand. And then the overall damage in terms of reputation and market image as well too. Those numbers can be a bit harder to measure, and so although we see we certainly see some advantages to that strategy still, the gaps are slightly closer there, and we attribute a lot of that to the overall inability to always be able to measure that effectively.
No problem. I was so interestingly, I look at the other side, and I feel like a lot of our customers are always saying it's not going to happen to me. It's not going to happen to me. But we want to reduce risk in case it does happen. And you see all these names on that slide. There are breaches happening all the time, and I think that a lot of our customers got to the point where they wake up in the morning and they say, "Yeah, is it going to happen to me today?" No, it's not going to happen to me. Then they go the next day and they wake up and they say, "Is it going to happen to me today?" And after a while, that gets a little bit exhaustive. And you start to realize when you see this unbelievable ocean of data breaches that happen, you have to start planning that it might happen to you, especially when it comes to speaking to your boss or the board and helping them understand from a big picture perspective the business is doing the right things. We won't be embarrassed by having this conversation if something does go wrong. We've taken the right steps. So when you look at the slide that you had up a minute ago and you look at the cost to the different approaches, trying to save money up front and doing it manually and ad hoc not only is unbelievably frustrating and unbelievably time consuming and not the job anyone wants to ever do, yes, that manual approach will save you money because you're not doing anything until it winds up happening to you. And that's where you start to see the Spirion user numbers significantly drop off, in many cases much less than 50%. And that's the thinking. I mean, the way most businesses run is every business decision is made thinking through, well, I'm going to roll the dice 100 times. What's my average outcome going to be? And the truth is we're living in a day and age when it's not about if you're going to get broken into, it's about when you're going to get broken into and how to manage that as efficiently as possible. So we're starting to see, again, whether it's Spirion or another product, we're starting to see much more of those automated tools be used and much more of that that classification help with the triaging of problems and sensitive data, because at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to save everything. You're not going to be able to secure every nook and cranny. You can, but it'll cost you a fortune. So is there an 80-20 rule or a 90-10 rule or a 99-1 rule that fits for your organization? So I just wanted to sort of put into comparison how this might apply to your organization, because the Ponemon findings are very interesting. And I do think that they provide a good justification for taking that step back and thinking more strategically, as opposed to, okay, what's the next security tool to buy? So Gabe, I don't know if you still can hear me or if you're waiting for someone to tell you Todd stop talking. But,
no, I can hear you now, and I apologize if I stepped on anything you were saying earlier. I don't know if you got a chance to cover that, or if you wanted to revisit something that.
I did a nice little. That was my recap on the last 5 slides.
Excellent.
But no, that's perfect, and it was all timely because I think I wanted it to all be summed up on that slide 15 with the key findings that you had up a second ago. So I think that showing those dollar figures really does put the punchline on it. Not to take away from the next slide, but I mean this to me really was a big surprise when we saw these numbers. I mean, I was hoping to see this type of stuff, but it's great that Ponemon was actually able to interview this many companies and get that data out in front of everyone.
So I'll kind of back that up with what I said early on, which was these were a lot of the things that we kind of intuitively knew. It was the overall vision of how the organization was created and what you guys set out to do when you started this 10 years ago. But to have that kind of in black and white really does not just help put that underline to it, but having been in security for long enough, there are a lot of best practices that get thrown around, and there are a few best practices that I can actually point to and say, okay, that's a best practice and it's backed up by this data that shows the outcomes of that, of folks that are doing these types of activities and showing their outcomes to it. So it's nice to be able to have that link between the two, to know that we're not doing things for things' sake and that they have measurable impacts throughout our environment. So let's talk about some of those activities, because we've learned a lot in looking at those outcomes. We've learned a lot in looking at the way our customers embrace overall data discovery and classification, and our vision for how that fits into the larger arena of data privacy and security. And this action plan checklist kind of outlines a number of things that led those folks to these outcomes. And again, I mentioned at the top of this call, but they're the full 28-page report, which I think we didn't want to just sit here and read through line by line for everyone, because that certainly may not lend itself to being the most exciting use of your time today, but will be made available so that you can read and peruse it at your pace. But let's look at some of the activities in the action plan checklist that we've derived from that. So first and foremost, identify what assets hold or carry sensitive information. I think we've made the case for this in a number of different ways, but let's look at the activities actually tied to that. So, being able to catalog your organization's major business processes. So what does that mean? So what we go through this in great depth in one of our other educational seminars. We have a whole boot camp series, and we talk a lot about being able to locate sensitive information and how looking at the business processes allows us to not just find information in places that we may not have thought, but also understanding what level of criticality to place against information when we're building out that information schema. And so when we identify which processes handle that critical and sensitive data, we want to make sure that it's appropriately tagged, that metadata, as Todd put it, is appropriately tagged and classified as such, so we know how to handle it, so that our security controls know how to handle it. Should that document be allowed to be attached and emailed? Should PHI information be allowed to live in that cloud environment? It very well might. That's a decision that is made based on those business processes, but enabled to enforce those policies comes down to your ability to map it directly back to the type of information that is throughout. Determine what data threat actors would want to steal. Very important. We know that those threat actors range from the opportunistic. We saw this last week where some ransomware folks literally just had a script that was running it, it executed it, it found some weak servers in a municipal transportation agency, and it encrypted a bunch of their sensitive information, right? And then we know that we have targeted adversaries that are going to be coming after specific types of data, either for the purpose of their own economic gain. Again, it may be ransomware, it may be espionage. Nonetheless, identifying those data, what it is those data threat actors want to steal, is in and of itself a logical classification exercise. And what we advocate to do here then is to take that information. Once you understand what that is they want to do, then apply those classifications to that data so that you can protect it as such. Again, equally determine what would be disrupted or cease to occur if that sensitive information were compromised. And we saw this in some of the results where those that took this approach had a far less economic impact in the event of an incident or a breach when they were able to identify the sensitive data types that would have caused some type of disruption and proactively taken measures to ensure that the impact was reduced. And we see that in the black and white numbers whereby it's a couple slides back now, but it was over 2.5 times less the amount of damage in that scenario. So you want to develop those realistic scenarios. What exactly could happen to my sensitive information? Who exactly has access to it, and what types of dangers does that cause? Identify those obvious elements that can lead to those financial loss, and apply those classifications again so that we can apply those security controls based on all of those realistic scenarios. And where you can, calculate the potential loss of systems or breach data using those scenarios. Something else that classification also allows you to do, if you are that mature in your security programs in general, if you're doing risk quantification, it's yet one more data point that you can plug into those calculations to understand economic impact. Todd, because this time I can hear you.
You know, Gabe, the stuff you're talking about is so on the point for the types of people that might be listening that do have to report to a board. I mean, this is the type of stuff people need to understand. And I don't like to beat up Sony Motion Pictures because they were the victim, but if the board had been able to see some of the data from the things Gabe was just talking about, and they knew things like, oh, okay, we have 601 Excel spreadsheets with no password protection, and they contain at least 1,000 social security numbers or more, the board would probably say, this is easy. IT, you know, hey, someone, go figure this out. Make sure that doesn't happen anymore. When it happens after the fact, everyone has egg on their face. And there's a lot of other examples like that, but what Gabe's hitting on is exactly the type of thing boards want to see the results of. They don't want all the details, but they want to know, great, we had 1 million records or 10 million records or 1,000 records, don't care. What do we have today? Oh, we have 10. That's a manageable risk. I can either accept that risk or I can now prioritize my security spend to allow that risk to be mitigated. Maybe we'll put a lot more encryption and secondary authentication and other stuff around where those last 10 pieces of data exist. So
Excellent.
Let's talk about how the board can see that a little bit better. I'm very excited that we're giving you a little sneak peek of our product release coming out later this year, right after the holidays. And what you're looking at is essentially the Spyglass, which is a new addition to our product that allows you to have a magnified view into all the valuable data in your organization. It is laid out to be able to give you and your teams, whether those are business department heads or people you report to or board members, a very easy glance at how we're doing, where we're at, and what the most important things we need to take care of are. If you look at the screen in front of you, I'm just going to walk you through exactly how it's laid out at a very high level. At the top, the long timeline graph across you could just make them all pop up, Gabe. If you look at the timeline across the top, that's going to show you for whatever period of time you want, all of the searches that you're conducting. So it allows you to see the types of progress that you're making as a company, the types of data you're trying to discover, and it is essentially mostly used so that you can say, look, things are still happening, we're still doing discovery, we're still doing classification, but the truth is that's going to be the timeline you use to easily manipulate the timing of all the other widgets. So we start with the big one in the center on the left side. We call that the footprint widget. So this gives you a view into your sensitive data footprint. So you get to use the timeline to say, what do I care about my footprint being? And as you can see in this example, there's obviously a lot of sensitive data, but what you see is the red line trends downward because of all that sensitive data. In time, this company had chosen to start to protect a lot of that data as opposed to get rid of it. Maybe they need it. Maybe they need that intellectual property for building whatever widgets they build. But the footprint's going to tell you exactly how much data you have, how much sensitive data you have, which will let you sort of put your thumb on that and say, great, how big of a problem do I have? If you have thousands and thousands and thousands of protected pieces of sensitive data, you might not care. But if you have millions of unprotected, that would be a big problem. But just knowing how much of a problem you have isn't enough. You need to know where it is. So to the right of that, we have a heat map, and this is showing you essentially where your sensitive data is. Now, we allow you to break this down into whatever type of view you want. What you see here would be sort of like the cloud bubble map for tags. Now, tags are not how I use the term with metadata, but tags within our product allow you to group things together. Now, you can sync all of that right with Active Directory so that you don't have to define anything. You just magically have every single organizational unit within your company appear here. And then you'll know, based on the color and the size, where the problems are and the biggest problems are, and where, of course, there aren't any problems. But it's not just based on your OUs. It could also be based on your endpoints. So instead of looking at all the tags in your environment or OUs in your environment, you could look at every single device, every database, every NAS, every desktop. Or you can look based on users. So we actually allow you to now drill down. So if you see a tag called human resources, because that's your OU for HR, you can now drill down into HR and see all of the endpoints in HR. And then you could drill down, let's say there's a specific server, you could drill down further and you can see every single user who owns data on that server. And we break it out for you to show you which users have the most amount of data, which ones have the least, which ones are the most protected, which ones are the least. And by the way, if there's interest, we can do a follow-up to this webinar and schedule a deep dive first look into Spyglass. So make that one of your pieces of feedback if you are interested in that. Before we move on to the next slide, I'm just going to run through the bottom row very quickly. As with our old dashboard, we give you statistical information about what's going on so you can know how many searches were conducted, how many endpoints, how many records, how many locations. We also give you something that we have been given feedback from our customers that's very important to them, the classification information. You can now do drill downs just by clicking on top secret. Every other widget in the Spyglass will be updated to only show you what's going on with top secret data. So you can literally just click on one thing now and you'll see how big your top secret classified data footprint is, which OUs or endpoints or users within your enterprise have the biggest problems or the most amount of top secret data, etc. The third widget is something that's going to help you understand if your policies are working, how much of your data is protected, how it's being protected. So we lay out for you in a nice fashion the data that's been shredded, redacted, encrypted. I'm missing a few, but certainly access control restricted. Another new thing in our product that allows you to minimize who has access to data. And that is coming out this year as well. And yes, Gabe mentioned quarantine. And on the bottom right, we added one for all of our customers, heavily demanded. I want to see an endpoint status so that I know at all times what's polling, what's not polling, what's doing this, what's doing that. So that's more of an operational widget. So that's the Spyglass. And again, it really is a major new feature if you think about it. Even though it's just displaying data, this now allows you to take information about your sensitive data and use it as a tool itself within your environment. Have conversations around, should we be spending more money on security? Should we be spending less money on security? Do we need to get rid of some of this data? Do we have a cultural problem? Are people sharing data too much? You know, one of the things you'd be able to do if you deployed Spirion and you had data in the cloud is you'd be able to see right here how much of your sensitive data is in Dropbox versus Box versus OneDrive versus, what am I missing? Google, did I say Google Drive? That's probably the one I didn't say. So it's going to be, you're going to have all this data at your fingertips. And for those of you who don't want to use the web browser, you can use your mobile phone, you can use your tablet, your iPad, we don't care. We've completely revamped our entire product to be HTML5 so that you're not stuck using Internet Explorer or Firefox or Chrome or what have you. We've made this very mobile and tablet friendly. You want to jump to the next slide, Gabe, or do you want to add anything on?
No, I think that nails it. I want to put a fine point below the ability to use this platform to share that information throughout the organization. Security in and of itself has a reputation sometimes of being somewhat inaccessible to the masses throughout the organization, especially as you move higher up through the ranks. And what we've really tried to do here is take that vision of what we know has worked for all of these many thousands of organizations and make that data accessible to everyone else so that you can get this holistic view of the overall risk in your environment, as Todd mentioned, allow you to make those decisions based on it. So let's jump to the next slide and let's have you talk a bit about what's behind all of that. Well, what's the platform built on and how it's powered and so forth?
So for those of you who don't know, I'm going to really be starting from the beginning, assuming you guys aren't customers, so I can lay this out appropriately. We essentially have multiple components to what make up the Spirion data platform. There are components that do the discovery and the classification, the remediation, and that's essentially built into our endpoint. And this is essentially either an agent-based platform or an agentless platform that you would want to remotely search, let's say an Oracle server, a SQL server, maybe you have a humongous multi-terabyte NAS, maybe it's a SharePoint site, again, the examples from earlier, Dropbox, Box, all that. So you can either search all those things remotely, agentlessly, and classify the data as well as protect it, or you can put an agent on a computer and then you can leverage our watcher mechanism so that in real time, as soon as an employee creates data, you can automatically classify that document using discovery results. For example, maybe your rule would be if at least one social security number exists, classified as HR data. And then you can leverage all your existing security investments to say files with metadata that have HR data tags may not be sent through email gateways, and your DLP product can block that. Maybe it has to be encrypted, and whatever encryption solution you use will automatically encrypt that file because of its classification. Lots of different scenarios there, but that's essentially the endpoint. Reporting is then aggregated at an enterprise level through our console, and that's where Spyglass fits in. But the console and the endpoints are the two main things. Now, the endpoints run on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and the console is browser-based, so you can use mobile phone, tablets, and any browser out there. Underneath the console, there's a lot of power. Now, really what we get to is sort of how you'll use it. Now, we talked about the Spyglass already, but there's also workflow automation, and I kind of just gave you the example of that. Imagine a user is just sitting at their computer. Let's say you have Spirion installed and McAfee hosts DLP. If a user happens to be in Excel and they copy and paste some HR data in, or let's take a different example, some intellectual property, and they save that file. The discovery agent determines as it goes through the file that's been newly changed that it's discovered an update containing sensitive information, and it happens to be intellectual property. So it gets classified as top secret. Now, all of this happens within a millisecond, but where you can leverage your other security investments like McAfee hosts DLP, it continues to monitor that file as well. so that if you tried to upload it to the cloud, they would block it. If you tried to copy it to a USB drive, they can block it. So now you have the ability to sort of use classification as a way to let your other security products communicate with each other. Using that workflow automation, you can say, these are my rules, I want data classified this way, and then the end result is other third-party software can be configured to behave differently based on how a document is classified. AnyFind is our secret sauce for finding all these different standard data types like social security number, credit card number, personal address, date of birth. Sensitive Data Engine is the same thing except for intellectual property. We've developed a custom methodology for allowing you to come up with your own ways to find intellectual property in an unbelievably accurate method. And then, of course, the notification engine works across all the products, but essentially we have notifications throughout to let people know, hey, there's sensitive data here. And then the rest of this, you know, it's here for you guys to read. You don't need to hear me sort of read all of it. I'd rather leave the last 10 minutes for Q&A. But we are trying to leave no stone unturned so that when a customer comes to us and says, listen, I might have sensitive data, I need to search everywhere for it. I don't want to be at risk. If a hacker can break in and get to it, I want to be able to get to it first. So as I mentioned, we have Windows, Mac, Linux. We do all file types. We list all the major ones at the bottom, but every file type can be searched. We can search via almost every type of protocol out there. So if it's visible from a Windows computer, there's no question we are likely to be able to search it. There's very few examples where something is extremely proprietary and they don't let other third parties such as us access the data to be able to actually see it, read it. It's not like we need to be able to modify it. We do the cloud now, so Office 365, that's your hosted Exchange, hosted SharePoint, on-prem SharePoint, of course, on-prem Exchange, of course, Azure, Amazon, as well as the databases, SQL, Oracle, DB2, anything else via OLEDB, anything else via potentially the drivers that you might have installed on your system, so if you have something that's extremely custom and proprietary. So, Gabe, I'll hand things over to you to close it out, but I would love to be able to answer some questions and as well as give you a chance to add anything to this slide if you wanted to finish it out with anything that I forgot to mention.
No, I think you certainly covered it. What I want to highlight is that I always want to tie this back, especially for the purpose of this conversation and this research, to the actual the underpinning of discovery and classification, and how the platform and everything you just described, its ability to look everywhere data would exist becomes a very integral part of that. We have a question come in that I think is quite timely as well too. So someone asked, you mentioned classifying new data and how that works with classifying data that already exists. I can take that one if you want. So classifying new data.
So that time it was on me. That was I was on mute on that one.
Now you just
so, did you want to take it, or
no, go for it.
I started to. So I was just trying to understand. A file has been classified as, let's say, restricted, and now the question is, what if you want to classify it differently as, let's say, confidential or top secret?
Actually, I think the question is, so we talked about how we can monitor the file system for files as they're created and so forth, but what about files that already exist, which is really where the bulk of most organizations' data is, right? There's those terabytes and terabytes and petabytes of existing data throughout the environment. And so the question was, how does this work for classifying data that does already exist?
Oh, I gotcha. Very simply. So there's going to have to be a baseline discovery. All of our customers go through the first discovery process. Now, Watcher does help you for that real-time classification of anything that's newly created or modified, but to the question of what about the 99.9% of my data that's just sitting out there, you go through a baseline discovery effort, and essentially that's where you'll leverage the agents or you'll leverage the agentless process. And into the console, all of that information gets aggregated so that you can start to see that timeline and that footprint in your Spyglass. But you would just go through that baseline discovery. And the beauty of that is, after you go through the baseline and it's in the system, we leverage search history so that subsequent searches and discovery and classification processes are so much faster.
Excellent. Follow-up to that same question by the same individual was, so what if we don't have classification? How do we know classify? Well, that's an excellent question, and somewhere near the top of this presentation, and you'll get a copy of it, I presented a classification schema that we created. So that's oftentimes a very common exercise that we do assist with. It's a relatively straightforward process for us to either through a series of short interviews or through our own understanding of your business and the different data types that you would likely already have in the organization. We have pre-existing templates or ones that we can customize exactly for that purpose. So that screenshot that I showed you of that classification schema does exactly that. There are some that are based on different regulatory requirements. So we have an impact calculus basically that allows us to plug in a couple of knowns, and it returns the different data types and the suggested classifications and suggested controls and so forth that should be in place for that. Let me jump to another question. Great question. So how accurate is the classification and how do you deal with false positives? So the lawyers aren't on the line, so I'm going to tell you it's 100% accurate. But the reality is, and we do publish this, it's over 99% accurate. And so how is that achieved? I'll let Todd jump down into some of the scenarios, but let me give you a high-level understanding of what that means. So there are validation algorithms that exist throughout the product that allows us to perform verification of what we know about data that we find, and we do that so that it goes above and beyond, you know, kind of your manual validators like regexes and so forth. So there's all kinds of other validators that are built into the product, and it uses everything from decision trees and checksums and Boolean logics, exact data matches, dictionaries. There's the optional use-defined rule builder. So there's a number of different ways that the system is capable of going through validation of the information that we search and return to eliminate those false positives. Because what we understand is we know that in order to facilitate the automation of those controls, which ultimately is the thing that's going to lead to that greater protection and reduced economic impact in the event of an incident, but more importantly, it also ensures that you are compliant. It helps with all those data governance activities and so forth. In order to be able to automate those processes and get them out of the hands of your end users who aren't in the business of being data security professionals, that accuracy has to be of the utmost importance. Todd, go and jump on that accuracy for me if you would.
You know, right from the get-go, accuracy has always been the most critical thing for our company because we have seen so many companies just be absolutely rife with frustration from the false positives. And the truth is, I used to work for the big six consulting firms, now the big four actually, and we used to implement products like Vontu and Reconyx and all the big names out there that have since been acquired. And companies just, when you get to that level of false positives that you can't even rely on the data, they wind up not using the tools effectively at all. So we built Spirion from the ground up with a focus on allowing us to get access to the data in a way that allows us to have an extremely high degree of accuracy. So instead of searching a file extremely quickly on an email gateway that really doesn't give us the opportunity to interrogate the file in the right manner, we can do it while it's in storage, lying at rest on your computer or right then and there when you're saving it. So, you know, for us, we use something called procedural validation. If that doesn't mean anything to you, there's 100 other names we've called it, but essentially we're using validation algorithms, and that's the most important takeaway for you guys. The product tries to use a number of rules to figure out if something looks like what it should, meaning a social security number, a credit card number, or date of birth. But we then, instead of presenting that to you as a positive, we then go through a series of validators, literally hundreds, to figure out what it's near, what type of text is above it, to the left of it, to the right of it, below it. We look at the information about the file. We look at PDFs differently than we look at Excel spreadsheets, differently than we look at Word documents. So these are all the things that go into our intellectual property, and our customers have said that it does give them the ability to rely on data better, and that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to say we have the lowest false positives just because it's fun and because we want to hear ourselves talk. It's to make our customers more productive.
There is quite a bit more that I can go in there, and I'll certainly follow up by email if you'd like with some more information there. But to Todd's point about how we look into documents, so there are a number of ways we also extract text to be able to perform that, and that includes OCR capabilities as well too, right? So all of those documents, because there's still a lot of legacy paper workflows that they can scan, and then they end up in systems for any number of reasons. And speaking of lawyers, lawyers are certainly quite guilty of that. They love paper still, and they love faxing it around and scanning it and emailing it to you and so forth. So depending on the file type there's a number of different ways we go about extracting that text, because none of those are actually built the same, and so the system takes all of those things into mind. Let me get another one in here. So what happens if a document is wrongly classified? Will it be able to pick it up and point it out and reclassify again? Well, that's an interesting question. So I assume that to mean that maybe someone manually classified something, and that's one of the largest challenges with manual classification, is end users, the data handlers, if you would, and even data producers have to be knowledgeable in what your classification schema is. So for example, we talked about you may want to classify something that has more than 10 Social Security numbers as being HR data, if you would. And why 10? Because a threshold lower than that, it may just be that you were working on your tax returns at home and you have it saved to your local machine. I know that's certainly something that we've seen no shortage of, right? I mean, we use our work environment sometimes for things that are personal, and you may have 3 or 4 Social Security numbers in there. It may not be that. It may just be one client document that has just one also. It may not be personally related, but nonetheless, we can label that with multiple classifications. We can say that this document has Social Security numbers in it. We can also say that based on your criteria, this document meets our threshold for HR data. Now, someone may have manually classified that document in the scenario that you just posed as being, well, let's just call it public, if you would, because they were working on a different project, and whether it was inadvertently or they legitimately think that all of the data in there needed to be accessible, or they wanted to mark it as such so that they could then email it to themselves at home, knowing that our controls in place wouldn't let them ship around HR documents. Yeah, the system would automatically pick that up. It would say, no, that's based on what we know is inside that document, based on the policies that you've asked us to enforce in place here, that document is indeed classified and should be, say, in the scheme I presented before, it should be C4, it should be restricted, and it will reclassify that, yes. There was another question. Are those classification definitions predefined, or do we have to establish those ourselves? There are a number of classifications that are already predefined in the system, and it will go ahead and apply those based on all the things that we've described before. So whether it's PHI data, PCI data, Social Security numbers, credit card information, the things that you may want to define and that you will need to define, documents that would only be recognized by the organizations that created it. A lot of times that looks like what you'd call intellectual property or something to that effect, right? So something that would really only be identifiable by your organization. There's the ability to create very detailed rules, if you would, that would locate and match that use a combination of all of the other validators that we already have built into the system, and then you layer that on with what you know about that document to be able to present that type of classification. So no, you don't have to perform some exercise whereby you'd have to establish all these yourselves. Those are built into the system. All right, looks like we're just a minute over the hour. I don't see any other questions at this time, but by all means, if you have any further questions, please feel free to follow up. You can reach out and email us. Now, where's my screen? Not progressing there. And as I mentioned before, the full 28-page document will be made available for you to read in its entirety, along with a copy of the slides. I want to thank you all again for joining me today, and I'd love to thank Todd for joining today as well. And with that,
yeah, thank you very much, Gabe. This was great.
Thank you.